Once upon a time, in a vast desert where the sand glowed silver beneath the moon, and the stars hung so low they seemed to whisper secrets to the dunes, there lived a caravan of desert foxes who carried an ancient and noble purpose. These were not ordinary foxes, though they appeared small and unassuming in the endless expanse of sand. They were the Moonlight Healers, guardians of a tradition as old as the desert itself, and every full moon, when the world turned luminous and dreams felt closer than daylight, they would begin their sacred journey across the dunes. The caravan consisted of 7 foxes, each with fur that ranged from cream to russet to the deep amber of sunset. Their eyes reflected the starlight, and their paws, adapted through generations, moved across the sand with barely a whisper. At the head of the caravan walked Zahara, the eldest fox, whose silver-tipped fur spoke of countless journeys and whose gentle wisdom had guided the group through sandstorms, scorching days and moonless nights when the path seemed to vanish entirely. Behind Zahara walked the others, Rashid, strong and steady, who carried the heaviest bundles, Layla, whose keen nose could detect the subtlest change in the wind, Tariq and Amara, siblings who moved in perfect synchronization, their steps matching like a gentle heartbeat, and Selma, the storyteller, who could recall every journey the caravan had ever taken, every landmark, every lesson learned beneath the stars. And then there was Zephyr, the youngest of them all. Zephyr had joined the caravan only 3 full moons ago, and his russet fur still held the brightness of youth, untouched by the bleaching sun of countless journeys. His eyes sparkled with excitement and curiosity, but also with something else, a restlessness, an urgency that made his paws itch to run ahead, to reach the destination before the journey had truly begun. He carried the smallest bundle of healing herbs, carefully wrapped in woven palm leaves, and though the weight was light, the responsibility was the same as any other member of the caravan carried. The healing herbs they transported were rare and precious, growing only in the Hidden Oasis, a secret place known to the foxes alone, where ancient springs bubbled up from deep beneath the sand, and where plants of remarkable healing properties flourished in the impossible conditions. These herbs could soothe fevers that burned like the midday sun, could mend wounds that refused to close, could bring restful sleep to those haunted by endless waking. The distant villages that dotted the desert's edge depended on these deliveries, and the foxes took their duty with the seriousness it deserved. As the full moon rose on this particular night, casting its gentle glow across the undulating sea of sand, the caravan gathered at the edge of the Hidden Oasis. The water reflected the moon like a mirror, and the healing herbs had been carefully harvested, their leaves still dewy with the oasis's blessing. Each fox checked their bundle, ensuring the wrappings were secure, that the precious cargo would survive the journey ahead. Zephyr adjusted his bundle for the 5th time, his tail swishing with barely contained energy. The night air was cool and perfect, the moon was bright,
and every part of him wanted to leap forward, to race across the dunes, to feel the wind rushing through his fur. He looked at the route ahead. 3 nights of travel across the great sweep, the vast emptiness of sand that stretched between the oasis and the villages. 3 nights felt like an eternity.
Zahara raised her head, her silver-tipped ears catching the whispers of the wind, reading the desert's mood as one might read the expression on a dear friend's face. She nodded slowly, satisfied with what the night told her, and then spoke in her gentle, measured way. The caravan would follow the ancient path she indicated with the tilt of her head and the position of her body, the path that curved around the dangerous loose sand valleys that skirted the edges of the rock formations where scorpions nested, that followed the firm ridges of the dunes where the sand had been packed by wind into reliable highways. It was not the straightest path, not by far. Looking at the stars, one could see that a direct route would cut the journey significantly shorter, but the caravan never took the direct route. Zephyr felt his impatience bubble up like water from the oasis springs. He gazed longingly at the straight path, the one that led directly toward the North Star, the one that promised to deliver them to the villages in half the time. Why did they always take the long way? Surely, he thought, with his young legs and boundless energy, he could prove that the shortcuts were safe, that the old ways were simply old, not necessarily wise. The caravan began to move, falling into their practiced rhythm. Zahara led with her steady, unhurried pace, and the others followed, their movements synchronized by years of journeying together. The sand whispered beneath their paws, and the night wrapped around them like a soft blanket. The desert, in the coolness of moonlight, transformed from a harsh and unforgiving place into something almost magical. The dunes rolled like frozen waves. The shadows created mysterious valleys and peaks, and the silence held a quality that felt less empty and more peaceful, as though the desert itself was resting. Zephyr fell into line, but his mind wandered. He calculated distances, estimated times, imagined the praise he might receive if he discovered a faster route. After all, wasn't innovation important? Wasn't it good to question and explore? He was young, yes, but that meant his eyes were fresh, his thinking unclouded by the repetition of tradition. The first night of travel passed in the quiet rhythm that characterized the caravan's journeys. They moved steadily across the firm ridges of the dunes, following the paths that generations of foxes had proven safe. The moon tracked slowly across the sky, and the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. Occasionally, Lila would pause, sniffing the air, reading messages in the wind that were invisible to eyes, but clear to her sensitive nose. Sometimes Rashid would shift his bundle slightly, redistributing the weight with practiced ease. Salma hummed softly, a wordless melody that seemed to match the rhythm of their paws in the sand. But Zephyr kept glancing to the side, where the direct shot beckoned. They were travelling along a curve, following the contour of a massive dune, when the straight shot across the valley of loose sand could have saved them half a night's walking. He could see the other side clearly. bathed in moonlight, looking perfectly safe. The sand appeared no different from the sand they walked upon. When they stopped to rest, as the sky began to pale with the approaching dawn, Zephyr approached Zahara. The eldest fox was settling into a shallow depression in the sand, preparing to wait out the dangerous heat of the day, when Zephyr spoke his thoughts. He gestured toward the path they had taken, the long curve, and then toward the valley they had circumvented. Why not cross directly? It would save so much time, and time meant they could help the villagers faster, didn't it? The herbs would arrive sooner. The sick would be healed sooner. Everything would be better, faster, more efficient. Zahara regarded him with her calm, starlit eyes. There was no annoyance in her gaze, no dismissal of his youth. Instead, she simply gestured with her nose toward the valley of loose sand, and then she did something unexpected. She picked up a small stone in her mouth and tossed it into the center of the valley. The stone landed with a soft sound, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sand around the stone began to shift. It moved in a way that solid sand should never move, flowing like water, rippling outward from where the stone had disturbed it. Within heartbeats, the stone had vanished, swallowed by sand that looked perfectly solid, but was, in fact, as treacherous as quicksand. Zephyr's ears flattened in realization. Zahara watched him understand, and then she settled her head on her paws, closing her eyes for the day's rest. The lesson had been given, wordlessly but clearly. The direct path was not always the safe path. The shortcuts that looked so appealing often hid dangers that were not visible until it was too late. As Zephyr curled into his own resting spot, he thought about what he had seen. But even as he acknowledged the danger of that particular shortcut, part of him still believed that there must be other ways, other opportunities to move faster. After all, that was just one valley. The desert was vast, and surely not every alternative route was dangerous. The day passed in the way desert days do, with heat that built slowly and then pressed down upon the world with tremendous weight. The foxes slept in the shadows of their own bodies, their breathing slow and shallow, conserving energy and water, waiting for the mercy of evening. As the sun finally descended and the temperature began to drop, they stirred, shook the sand from their fur, and prepared for the second night of travel. This night would take them through the region of the Standing Stones, ancient rock formations that jutted from the sand like the fingers of giants reaching toward the stars. The path Zahara chose wound between these formations, following a route that zigzagged and seemed to backtrack, adding distance to their journey in a way that made Zephyr's tail twitch with frustration. His impatience, which had been simmering since the beginning of the journey, suddenly flared into decision. The caravan was moving slowly, following Zahara's careful navigation around the Standing Stones. In that moment, Zephyr made a choice. He would take the shortcut through the corridor, prove it was safe, and then rejoin the caravan on the other side. He would show them that sometimes the direct path was the right path, that youth and boldness had value alongside age and caution. Without announcing his intentions, Zephyr slipped away from the line. His small size and the darkness made it easy to separate from the group unnoticed. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he darted toward the moonlit corridor between the standing stones. The sand beneath his paws felt smooth and fast, and he ran with the joy of freedom, feeling the wind stream through his fur, feeling clever and capable and independent. The corridor was just as clear as it had appeared from a distance. The walls of stone rose on either side, ancient and weathered, their surfaces carved by millennia of wind into strange flowing shapes. Zephyr ran faster, confident in his choice, already imagining how surprised and impressed the others would be when he appeared ahead of them, proving that his route was better. But then, as he neared the middle of the corridor, the wind changed. It had been gentle and steady before, but now it began to swirl, coming from multiple directions at once, bouncing off the stone walls in confusing patterns. Sand began to lift, at first just a light dust, but quickly growing thicker. The corridor, it turned out, was a natural wind tunnel, and at certain times of night when the temperatures shifted and the air currents changed, it became a trap.
Within moments, Zephyr found himself in the midst of a localized sandstorm. The wind howled between the stone walls, amplified by the narrow space, turning what should have been a clear path into a stinging, blinding chaos. Sand filled his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He couldn't see the stars, couldn't orient himself, couldn't tell which direction led forward and which led back. The sound of the wind against the stones was deafening, a roar that drowned out any other sensation. Panic rose in his chest. He tried to run forward, but the sand was too thick, the wind too strong. He stumbled, regained his footing, stumbled again. His bundle of healing herbs, so carefully secured at the beginning of the journey, began to slip from his back as the wind tore at the wrappings. He tried to adjust it, but his paws found only air where the bundle should have been. Somewhere in the chaos, it had fallen. Zephyr crouched low, trying to protect his face from the stinging sand, trying to breathe without inhaling the choking dust. He was completely disoriented, alone in the darkness and wind, and for the first time in his young life, he understood what true danger felt like. This wasn't an adventure. This wasn't proving himself. This was a mistake that could cost him everything. And then, through the roar of wind and sand, he felt something, a presence beside him, steady and warm. A body pressed against his, blocking some of the wind. He opened his eyes just enough to see Rashid, the strong fox who carried the heaviest burdens, who had somehow found him in the chaos. Rashid's larger body created a shelter from the worst of the wind, and he guided Zephyr's movements with gentle nudges, directing him back toward the entrance of the corridor, back toward safety.
Behind Rashid came Layla, her nose to the ground, following their scent despite the overwhelming smell of dust and stone. And behind her came Zahara, moving with purpose through conditions that would have paralyzed a less experienced traveler. Together they formed a chain, and they pulled Zephyr out of the wind tunnel, out of the corridor, back to where the air was clear and the stars were visible, and breathing didn't require fighting for each breath. When they finally emerged into the calm night air, Zephyr collapsed onto the sand, coughing and gasping. His fur was full of dust, his eyes burned, and his heart hammered in his chest. But worse than any physical discomfort was the weight of shame that settled over him. He had abandoned the caravan, he had thought he knew better, and he had lost his bundle of healing herbs, the precious cargo that people in distant villages were depending upon. The other foxes gathered around him, checking him for injuries, licking the sand from his face and ears. There was no anger in their actions, no punishment or scolding. They simply cared for him as they would care for any member of the caravan who had been hurt, and somehow their kindness made the shame feel even heavier. When Zephyr had recovered enough to stand, when his breathing had calmed and his eyes had cleared, Zahara led the group to a sheltered spot beneath one of the standing stones. They would rest here for a while before continuing, giving Zephyr time to fully recover. As they settled, Salma, the storyteller, moved close to Zephyr. She began to share a story without words, communicating through gestures and expressions and the ancient language of her kind. She told him about a caravan from long ago, from before even Zahara's time, when the healing traditions were newer and the paths across the desert were still being learned. In that caravan there had been a fox much like Zephyr, eager and quick, and certain that speed was the greatest virtue. That fox, Salma conveyed, had also sought shortcuts. He had found a path across a sun-baked flat that looked solid and dependable, a path that would have saved an entire night of travel. He had convinced another young fox to accompany him, and together they had raced across the flat, feeling the thrill of speed and innovation. But the sun-baked surface had been deceiving. Beneath the hard crust was mud, soft and deep, left from rare desert rains that had occurred weeks before. The crust broke beneath the weight of the two foxes, and they sank into the mud, struggling to free themselves. By the time the rest of the caravan found them, one of the young foxes had exhausted himself in the struggle. He survived, but only barely, and he never regained the same strength he had possessed before. The caravan, Salma continued, had lost precious time in the rescue. The healing herbs had arrived at the villages late, and though most were helped, one elderly person who might have recovered with earlier treatment had passed beyond the help of even the most powerful herbs. Salma's eyes, reflecting the moonlight, held a deep sadness as she finished the story. This was why the caravan followed the ancient paths, not because they were opposed to new ideas or because they were stubborn in their old ways, but because every turn in the route, every seeming inefficiency represented hard-earned knowledge. The paths they followed had been proven safe by generations of travellers.
Shortcuts might work 9 times out of 10, but the caravan could not afford that 10th time when lives depended on their reliability.
Zephyr listened to the story, and something shifted inside him. He had been thinking about the journey as though speed was the goal, as though reaching the destination was what mattered. But the caravan's purpose wasn't simply to arrive, it was to arrive safely, to arrive with their precious cargo intact, to arrive in a way that could be repeated reliably, moon after moon, year after year. The villagers didn't need the herbs faster. They needed the herbs consistently. They needed to know that every full moon, without fail, the caravan would come. Patience, he began to understand, wasn't about being slow. It was about being steady. It was about trusting the process, trusting the wisdom of those who had walked the path before, trusting that the long way was the long way for a reason. As the night deepened and the time came to resume the journey, Zephyr felt different. The restless energy that had characterized his first days with the caravan had been replaced by something quieter but more substantial. When he stood to continue walking, Tariq approached him and indicated that Zephyr should share his bundle. The healing herbs that Zephyr had lost would be redistributed among the other members, and Zephyr would help carry portions of their loads. He would still contribute, still be part of the caravan's purpose, even though he had made a mistake. The generosity of this gesture, the way the caravan simply adapted and continued rather than dwelling on his error, taught Zephyr another lesson about patience. The foxes didn't waste time on recrimination or anger. They acknowledged what had happened, learned from it, and moved forward. There would be time later to gather more herbs from the oasis, time to make up for what had been lost. But now, in this moment, the task was simply to continue the journey with what they had. The second night of travel continued through the standing stones, following Zahara's careful navigation. This time, Zephyr stayed in line, observing rather than questioning. He noticed things he hadn't seen before when his mind had been focused on speed and shortcuts. He noticed how Zahara would pause periodically, not out of tiredness, but to check the group, to ensure everyone was managing their burden, to read the wind for signs of changing conditions. He noticed how Lila would sometimes take a slightly different angle than expected, following her nose to avoid areas where the sand was too soft or where hidden obstacles lay beneath the surface. He noticed the way Rashid would occasionally brush against Amara or Tariq, a wordless gesture of encouragement, a reminder that they were together in this effort. He noticed Salma's constant attention to landmarks, the way she seemed to be memorizing every detail of the journey, storing the information for future caravans, for future stories that would teach and guide. And he noticed that the pace, which seemed so slow to his impatient mind, was actually perfectly calibrated. It was fast enough to cover the necessary distance each night, but slow enough that no one became exhausted, slow enough that they could remain alert for dangers, slow enough that the journey itself became a meditation rather than a race. The rhythm of their paws in the sand
created a peaceful cadence that matched the rhythm of the desert night, the slow wheel of the stars, the gradual cooling of the air, the gentle persistence of the wind, reshaping the dunes grain by grain.
As dawn approached, marking the end of the second night, the caravan reached the Whispering Ridge, a long, elevated dune that ran like a spine through the desert. From this ridge, as the sky began to lighten with the approaching sun, they could see the distant shimmer of the villages, still far away, but visible now on the horizon. They were 2/3 of the way through their journey. Here, at the Whispering Ridge, the caravan rested during the heat of the day. The ridge caught the breeze, making it slightly cooler than the surrounding lowlands, and the view it offered allowed Zahara to read the desert's conditions to plan the final night's approach. Zephyr settled into his resting spot, exhausted from the night's travel and the lingering effects of his adventure in the wind corridor. As he rested, he reflected on the journey so far. He thought about how his original estimation that they could reach the villages in half the time by taking direct routes had been based on nothing but assumption and youthful confidence. He had not known about the quicksand valleys, the wind tunnels, or the countless other dangers that the desert concealed beneath its beautiful moonlit surface. He had not considered that the villages were depending on the caravan's reliability, not their speed. The wisdom of the long path was becoming clear to him, but it was more than just understanding the specific dangers. It was about recognizing that some things couldn't be rushed, that some processes had their own natural pace, and trying to force them faster only introduced risk and instability. The healing herbs needed to travel at a pace that kept them secure and protected. The foxes needed to travel at a pace that kept them safe and strong. The tradition needed to continue in a way that could be sustained moon after moon, year after year. Zephyr was beginning to understand that patience wasn't passive waiting. It was active participation in a process that unfolded at its own necessary speed. The day passed, and as evening approached, the foxes stirred for their final night of travel. This last stretch would take them down from the Whispering Ridge across the Singing Flats, where the wind created eerie musical notes as it passed over exposed bedrock, and finally to the edge of the desert where the villagers waited. It was the longest single stretch of the journey, but also the safest, as they would be gradually descending and the terrain would become more forgiving as they approached the region where underground water brought life closer to the surface. As they prepared to depart, Amara approached Zephyr. She was carrying a small bundle, carefully wrapped, and she indicated that Zephyr should take it. Inside were healing herbs, portions that each member of the caravan had contributed from their own supplies, creating a new bundle for Zephyr to carry. It wasn't as large as his original bundle, but it was substantial, and the gesture behind it made his throat tighten with emotion. They trusted him still. Despite his mistake, despite his impatience and the loss it had caused. They were giving him another chance to fulfill his responsibility. The bundle felt heavier than it should have, not from physical weight, but from the weight of that trust and the determination he felt to prove worthy of it. The third night's journey began with the descent from the Whispering Ridge. The slope was gentle, but required careful attention, as loose sand could cause even experienced travellers to slip and tumble. Zahara led the way, choosing a zigzagging path down the slope that might have looked inefficient, but actually provided the most stable footing. Zephyr followed, placing his paws exactly where those ahead of him had stepped, trusting the proven path. The singing flats stretched before them, vast and relatively level, the exposed bedrock creating a different surface than the sand-covered dunes they had been crossing. As they walked across this strange landscape, the wind indeed created musical notes, high and low, harmonizing in ways that seemed almost deliberately composed. The sound was haunting and beautiful, and it created an atmosphere that felt both ancient and timeless. As they crossed the singing flats, moving steadily towards the distant villages, Zephyr found himself falling into a deeper understanding of the journey. Each step across this final stretch was teaching him something that went beyond the specific lessons of avoiding quicksand or wind tunnels. He was learning about the value of consistency, about how small, steady actions, repeated over and over, created something far more reliable than occasional bursts of speed or brilliance. The caravan didn't succeed because any individual fox was particularly fast or strong or clever. They succeeded because they worked together at a sustainable pace, because they followed proven methods, because they showed up moon after moon and did the work that needed doing. This reliability, this patient consistency was what made them valuable to the villages. This was what made their tradition meaningful. Zephyr thought about his own life beyond the caravan, about the things he wanted to accomplish, the fox he wanted to become. He had always thought in terms of achievements and milestones, reaching goals as quickly as possible, proving himself through dramatic gestures. But watching the caravan work, seeing how their collective patience and steady effort created something truly worthwhile, he began to reconsider what success actually meant. Maybe success wasn't about rushing to the finish line. Maybe it was about showing up consistently, doing the work day after day, trusting that the small steps would accumulate into something significant over time. Maybe the patient process was the point, not just the means to an end. As the night deepened and the stars reached their highest point in the sky, the terrain began to change. The hard bedrock of the singing flats gave way to firmer sand, and then to sand that was darkened by underground moisture. Sparse vegetation began to appear, hardy desert plants at first, then gradually more growth as they approached the fertile zone where the villages had been established. The air smelt different here, carrying hints of cultivated gardens and the smoke of evening fires. The villages appeared as clusters of warm lights against the darkness, and as the caravan drew closer, Zephyr could make out the shapes of simple buildings, the outlines of palms and date trees, the movement of people beginning their early morning activities. The arrival of the caravan was timed to occur just before dawn, when the night's coolness was giving way to the gentleness of early light, when the sick could be attended to before the heat of the day made treatment more difficult.
People emerged from the buildings as the caravan approached, their faces brightening with relief and gratitude. Among them were healers who knew how to prepare the herbs, family members caring for sick loved ones, village elders who understood the importance of the tradition the foxes maintained. There were children, too, whose eyes widened with wonder at the sight of the desert foxes arriving, as they did every full moon, as reliable as the moon itself. The distribution of the herbs was conducted with care and reverence. Each bundle was unwrapped, the precious plants examined and sorted, appropriate portions given to those who needed them. The foxes remained for a short while, resting in the shade offered by the grateful villagers, accepting water and small offerings of food. They would begin their return journey the following night, travelling back across the desert to the Hidden Oasis, where they would rest and prepare for the next full moon's journey. As Zephyr presented his bundle of herbs, the one created from the contributions of his fellow travellers, he felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with speed or efficiency. The journey had taken exactly as long as it needed to take. The process had unfolded at its necessary pace, and by trusting that process, by practicing patience, by learning to value consistency over haste, he had become part of something larger and more meaningful than any individual achievement. An elderly healer, her hands gnarled but gentle, accepted Zephyr's bundle and looked into his eyes with a knowing expression. She could see something in him, perhaps, a change, a deepening, a new understanding. She nodded her approval, and in that simple gesture, Zephyr felt acknowledged in a way that meant more than any praise for speed or cleverness could have meant.
As the sun rose fully over the desert, painting the dunes in shades of gold and amber, the caravan settled into the shade for their day of rest. Tomorrow night they would begin the return journey, following the same careful paths, maintaining the same patient pace. And the moon after that, they would make the journey again, and again, and again. This was the work, this was the practice, this was the life of the caravan. Zephyr curled up in his resting spot, his body tired in a satisfying way, his mind quiet and clear. He looked back across the desert they had crossed, seeing now not a barrier to be conquered or an obstacle to overcome, but a teacher, a landscape that revealed its lessons only to those who moved through it with patience and respect. The shortcuts he had been so eager to find would have bypassed all of this learning. They would have been faster, perhaps, but they would have taught him nothing. The value wasn't in the destination, he finally understood. The value was in the journey itself, in the process of moving steadily forward, in trusting that the long way was teaching him what he needed to know, in having patience with the natural unfolding of growth and change. Some things couldn't be rushed. Some wisdom could only be gained through the slow accumulation of experience, through showing up consistently, through respecting the process even when it felt inefficient or unnecessary. As sleep began to claim him, Zephyr felt something settle in his heart. A peace he hadn't known he was missing. The restless urgency that had defined his early weeks with the caravan had been transformed into something quieter, but far more powerful. A patient commitment to the work, a trust in the process, a willingness to take things at their necessary pace.